Good morning, guys. So, the question for today is what makes a player truly world class? Now, this is a question that has been raging online since time immemorial. As long as you have two people, two persons looking at the same player using different metrics, one can arrive at, or both can arrive at separate conclusions about the same player. Take Declan Rice, for example. There are those who do not think that Declan Rice is world class. There are others who say Declan Rice is world class, and there's a third group of people who hate Arsenal and will say Declan Rice is just simply overrated, right? So, there is no, foregone conclusion as to what exactly makes a player world class. But today I'm going to go over some questions that people have to ask themselves before they consider what makes a player world class, right? So the first question we have to ask is being the best player in your position currently make you world class? Now, I think people will hear that question and automatically go, well, yes, that makes sense. If you're the best right now, yeah. There's a caveat though. Let's look for example at Marco Corella, who plays at left back. Now he's a great player, right? Nobody can deny that Marco Corella is a great player, very great pass off the ball, good defensively. But compare him to an Ashley Cole, who is undoubtedly world class. Compare him to an Andrew Robertson, who was undoubtedly world class. Would you put Marco Corella in the same category as those players? I personally wouldn't, right? And again, I'm not slagging off Marco Corella. I do think Marco Corella is a great player, but world class? I don't know. I think we have to be careful here with, we have to be clear on what we're saying here. I think Marco Corella is an elite player. I think he's just a level below world class, right? But we're so quick to, put players in that world class category. Maybe because, we're lacking a lot of those players currently. And that's another topic for debate. But being the best in the world, in your position currently, does not necessarily make you world class. You can also look, for example, at the striker situation. Now, Haaland is clearly world class. Harry Kane is clearly world class. But who is the next striker that's up there, right? You look at, for example, at maybe Isak. Would you consider Isak to be world class? Elite, maybe I don't know about world class. You look at, Sesko, Gyökeres. Are these guys world class? I mean, they're the best in their position right now, right? Currently, but would I consider these guys world class? No, I think elite maybe is the better word for it, or decent. I don't know, but I wouldn't consider them other than Haaland and Kane, right? And if you consider Mbappe as a striker, who else is really up there that you would consider to be world class, even though they're the best in their position, right? So, we have to be careful with that. So my answer to that is no. Not being the best in your position, in the league or in your country, that doesn't necessarily make you world class. That's my view. The next question is how long does a player have to perform to be world class? Can a one season wonder be world class? Do you have to be 2, 3 seasons in before you consider world class? No, there's no hard and fast rule to this. For example, Lamine Yamal, he's been doing it for what 2, 3 seasons now, and I consider Yamal to be world class. Right, that's my opinion. I consider him to be world class. Others would say, he's too young. He needs to be, 21, 22, 23 before you decide that he's world class. But I don't think so. I think Yamal has demonstrated world class talent, world class ability. The ability to take on a player, and he's been, like I said, he's been doing it, multiple seasons now. So, I don't think, to answer the question, I don't think one season can define you being world class, right? I think you can have a world class level season, right? Because you do have one season wonders. I don't know if anybody remember, Me Too, for example, who scored 27 goals, right? Charlie Austin, who scored 16 goals, right? So you can have a world class level season, but that doesn't necessarily make you world class. I think you definitely have to be doing it over at least 2, 3 seasons consistently. I don't think the age matters. That's why I mentioned Yamal. I don't think the age at which you do it matters. Because if you're 30 and suddenly you pick up steam and then, you do it 31, 32, 33, you can reach world class levels. Then look at Jamie Vardy, for example. Jamie Vardy at 26, 27, 28 was not world class. But there was a point for a couple seasons at Leicester that Jamie Vardy clearly was a world class player, right? So, age doesn't necessarily matter, but I think time matters. Time and consistency definitely matters, right? Another question that people have to look at: does winning trophies matter? Now, this is a hard one to answer because you will have players, for example, who will be on a team and they bench and win, right? They'll win. And you look, for example, at their trophy cabinet, you look at their honors, and they have a bunch of, they won FA Cup, League Cup, Premier League, all these things, but that doesn't necessarily make you world class, right? You look, for example, at Steven Gerrard. No, yes, Gerrard won the Champions League, won a couple FA Cups, but he never won the Premier League. Does not make Gerrard not a Premier League legend? Does that not make him world class? I think trophies help to strengthen or reinforce the argument for being world class. But again, at the end of the day, winning a trophy is a team effort. I think you have to look at the individual, and if you look at the player individually, right? You can determine whether or not the player is world class. So, yes, trophies matter. Yes, you have to include trophies, and trophies might reinforce, especially if the player was instrumental in winning the trophy, right? But at the end of the day, trophies do not necessarily make you a great player. I hope I explained that well, because you do have players who have an extensive trophy cabinet and they're not that great, right? You look, for example, biggest example currently, Ferran Torres. Now, Ferran Torres scored the winning goal at the World Cup. Ferran Torres is a great player. Is he a world class player? No, but he won the World Cup. He scored the winning goal of the World Cup. Doesn't make him a world class player. And listen, again, I'm not slagging off Ferran Torres. He scored a brilliant goal at the World Cup. Brilliant goal. Deserve all the praises that he's getting now. But that doesn't necessarily make him world class, right? We can agree on that, right? We can agree on that. So yes, trophies matter, but it's not the ultimate thing. It's just a tool to reinforce whether or not a player can be considered world class based on their contribution, right? Another question we can look at is, how much should individual statistics matter? That goes into what I just said. It definitely matters because, but then again, there's a caveat to that too, because you also have to look on the league in which the player is in, right? A player, for example, in let's say a lower league can score 50 goals. We've seen, for example, players in Portugal's league score 30 goals, score 40 goals, and that does not translate necessarily to the Premier League. Darwin Núñez, Gyökeres, even though Gyökeres, this is his first season in the Prem, or this was his first season in the Prem, but it doesn't necessarily translate. So you can't just use individual statistics as well, right? Because that can also trick you into coming to the conclusion that, hey, this player is in this league, he scored 60 goals in 70 appearances in the Bundesliga, or in the Portuguese league, or in the Dutch league. Let's get this player over here. For example, another example for Manchester United, Donny van de Beek, right? He was touted as world class. Some people touted him as world class for that Ajax side. Came to Manchester United, absolutely flopped, and then flopped afterward wherever he ended up. And again, people, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to these players, right? This is just me giving my opinion on what I think, right? And then you have some other questions, right, that you have to ask, right? How do you determine, for example, if a defensive midfielder is world class, right? Like, what do you use? You understand what I mean? Like, how do you look at it? Is it just interceptions? Like, there's the eye test, there's the statistics, there's all sorts of different metrics, right? That you can look at, and for example, a defensive midfielder won't get all the goals and assists, right? They won't have all that. But how do you determine then that's world class? Rodri, for example, doesn't have a lot of goals and assists. Neither does Xavi Hernandez, Iniesta, all of these guys. But we can clearly say, okay, these players were world class, right? So what exactly do you look at? What metric do you use? And for these kind of players who, you know, the individual statistics may be a little obscure as to what you use, right? So yes, it's helpful to some, and it might not be helpful to others, right? It all depends on the where you're playing, right? The position you're playing, those are the stats you look. So progressive passes, even though I hate that term, you know, assist, yeah, I guess assist could count. But then there's the counter to that where you have, for example, players like Bruno Fernandez, who, by the way, yes, he's world class. He's not my favorite player, but I have to give him that. He's world class, right? But Bruno Fernandez is a stat padder. Bruno Fernandez is a stat merchant. He's a guy who spams crosses into the box, spams ball into the box. But at the end of the day, he's very effective at what he does, and I think he's world class. I'll begrudgingly give Bruno Fernandez world class status. So in conclusion, there's so many different questions I have here as to what makes a player world class. Is world class about ability? Should potential count? Is consistency more important than a high peak? All these different questions that you ask, what makes a player world class? So here is my conclusion. I think it's hard to determine. I think it's truly hard to determine what makes a player. I think the eye test is important, right? Like watching the player, play the game, watching, how the player, execute, like what function the player has and how well they execute the function. I think that's the best way I can put it, right? So if you have, for example, a six and you want him to be a brute in midfield, breakout play, that's what you have him for, and that's what he does, then he's world class. So, for example, Kante. If you have a six who you want to be a deep line playmaker, pass the ball well, not necessarily a destroyer in midfield, and he does that, then that might constitute world class. It all depends on the function of the player, how well the player executes that function, and the consistency with which the player executes that function. So if I can look at a player and every week I get a 7, 8 out of 10 out of this player consistently, I think that player is world class. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Do you think I covered enough? Are there other metrics that you would use to determine what's world class? Let me know, guys. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'm at 51 subscribers. Thanks for letting me reach 50 before the end of August. That was the aim. So let's get to 100 by at least, let's say, the end of, or let's say the middle of September. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks for tuning in to JJ's Football Corner. Have a good day.